country after country, communism is in collapse. Is this the beginning of a new age of democracy and progress? That's the hope. Yet we all know instinctively that the world faces an immense task. After all, the 20th century was born in hope. The world was at peace and democracy ascendant. But instead of a century of harmony, we found ourselves in a century scarred by war and misery, tyranny and fear. What happened? For all we did right, where did we go wrong? As America struggles to assure the success of democracy today, there's much to be learned from the struggles of this past century. We've earned ourselves a second chance. This time, can it be happily ever after?
Century, America, a time of great prosperity and even greater confidence. Our steel industry was the largest in the world. Our railroads the most extensive. Our farmers the most productive. America had become an economic giant since the Civil War, but we had grown largely in isolation. Only now do we begin to see ourselves as a world leader. The democratic experiment that had begun over a century before was flourishing, and Americans were certain that the fruits of democracy would improve life not just at home, but across the globe. The 19th century had brought unprecedented progress. We had only to look around ourselves to see an array of innovations that were changing the very conditions of human existence. Central heating, indoor plumbing, and good lighting were giving ordinary people a quality of life unknown even to the rich a century earlier. Ocean liners could cross the Atlantic in only a week. Words could circle the globe in a matter of minutes. Engineers could span long distances, even cut across a continent to join two oceans. Technological and economic advances had become, in turn, engines of social progress. School education had become commonplace. Political power spread far down the social scale. Male suffrage was now universal, and women were on the march.
The links between innovation and freedom, progress and democracy were manifest, and our faith in America was absolute. As one Midwest senator proclaimed, God has marked the American people as his chosen nation to finally lead in the regeneration of the world. This is the divine mission of America. We are trustees of the world's progress, guardians of its righteous peace. At the dawn of the 20th century, America believed that our own example of economic achievement and human freedom showed the way, and that the rest of the world would surely follow. But it was not to be.
The great powers of Europe were still caught up in ancient national rivalries. Their politicians and statesmen still saw the world in terms of territory and conquest. Growth was new colonies. Power was battleships. When the German Kaiser spoke of a place in the sun, he meant surpassing Britain in navy and empire. In fact, Germany already had achieved her place in the sun. She was the most industrialized nation in Europe. Her steel mills outproduced Britain and France combined. Germany had grown rich and powerful by trading with her neighbors. There was nothing to be gained and much to lose by waging war on them. But then, in a far-off provincial capital of the Austrian Empire, a lunatic murdered a man of feathers and uniforms. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand had no real importance, but in his death, the Austrian government saw a chance to crush the rising Slavic nationalism that posed a threat to their empire. Backed by a German government blind to the dangers of war and ignoring Russian warnings, Austria called up her army and declared war on her neighbor, Serbia. The chains of alliances pulled, and one by one, Russia, Germany, France, and Great Britain plunged into war. Every nation expected a short war. None anticipated the magnitude of the cataclysm they had so thoughtlessly unleashed. Instead of dashing heroics and quick, decisive battles, the war bogged down into a bloody, endless, gloryless stalemate. First day of the Battle of the Somme, 60,000 British soldiers fell to German guns. The 10-month-long Battle of Verdun cost France 540,000 men and Germany 430,000. In 4 years of war, more than 12 million men were killed or wounded on the Western Front. And the battle lines changed hardly at all. Any purpose the leaders of Europe hoped to achieve had been overwhelmed by the almost unimaginable destruction of human life.
Only President Woodrow Wilson recognized that this carnage could have a higher purpose. When America entered the war, it was to make the world safe for democracy. We would lead the world to a future free from the ancient national rivalries that had triggered the murderous catastrophe, to a future where peace and prosperity could flourish. With America's power, the Allies defeated Germany. At war's end, Wilson sought a treaty that would define a new age of democracy. But when the leaders of Europe gathered to negotiate, they demanded that Germany and Austria pay for the losses of the war with both territory and treasure. In the discussions that followed, Wilson was sidetracked by his idealistic vision of a League of Nations. In the end, he gave up virtually every substantive point, and the Treaty of Versailles became an instrument of vengeance. Wilson came home to campaign for the treaty, but as its details became known, America grew disillusioned. might have served had been betrayed by old-world politics and the weakness of our own president. In our first great opportunity to lead the world, we had failed. America rejected the treaty and the League of Nations. We turned our backs on Europe. We retreated into isolationism, leaving a moral and political vacuum. A vacuum new forces hostile to democracy would fill.
In the capital and mutiny in the army forced the Tsar to abdicate. Moderate democratic leaders took over the government. But the radical Bolsheviks wanted to end the war with Germany. So Germany helped their exiled leader, Vladimir Lenin, return to Russia. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in a coup d'etat. Lenin declared to his followers, "We shall now proceed to build the socialist order." The largest nation on earth was now governed by a small clique determined to impose its own vision of the future on Russia and the world. Throughout Europe, the aftermath of the war brought economic hardship, and that bred political instability. Leftists hoped to emulate the Bolshevik success, and a wave of communist agitation swept the capitals of Europe. Even in London, crowds turned out to support the marches, and strikes crippled the nation. In Italy, the democratic government turned to private vigilante armies to quell the leftists. Among them, the fascists, the black shirts, led by Benito Mussolini. In 1922, the black shirts marched on Rome, and Mussolini took over the government that had depended on him for survival. Italian democracy was gone. Dictatorship of the right was born, and Mussolini, not Lenin, became the model for many. Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Lithuania, Portugal, all installed dictatorships in the 1920s. In Germany, the situation was even more unstable. The new democracy had been discredited by the Treaty of Versailles. The country was being crushed economically by the demand for reparations. To pay them, the government simply printed money. The worst hyperinflation in history resulted. By 1923, a working man's shirt cost a year's salary. The situation was ripe for a right-wing takeover. Inspired by Mussolini's success, Adolf Hitler attempted a coup in Munich, but the police opened fire on his supporters and arrested him, winning Germany a temporary reprieve.
But America was largely unconcerned. We had washed our hands of European politics. We were occupied with our own prosperity. Here at home, a businessman and entrepreneur was changing the very shape of society. It began just before World War I. Henry Ford took the automobile, a toy for the rich, something that would cost the equivalent of $250,000 today, and made it into something everyone could afford. The key was the continuously moving assembly line. Ford got the idea at a meatpacking plant, where beef carcasses moved down a line and were quickly, efficiently disassembled. He reversed the process and initiated modern mass production. efficiency, in turn, led Ford to his most far-reaching innovation: the $5-a-day wage. At the time, the American worker was lucky to earn half that. But Ford realized that by cutting costs through the assembly line, he made cars for less, and that by paying higher wages, he created more customers. This simple, brilliant insight would transform America. The work week would go from 60 hours or more to 40 hours or less. Real wages would increase tenfold. More and more working Americans would join the ranks of the middle class. In an unanticipated way, Henry Ford had moved forward the aims of democracy. A wave of new products began improving life for the average American. A joke of the day had an indignant farmer tell an appliance salesman, "My wife ain't wore out yet." But labor-saving devices quickly became a necessity for the growing middle class, helping to free people from age-old drudgeries. And the automobile itself was changing the pattern of life. It gave people mobility, freedom, and affluence undreamed of only a generation before. We could travel, or park, or move from rental apartments in the city to our own homes in the suburbs. To put more of the good life within the means of more people, installment credit was introduced. And to sell it all more effectively, advertising became an art and an industry in its own right. By the end of the decade, the consumer society was in place, and the American way of life was established as the model and envy of the world.
In Europe, too, prosperity was returning. Post-war instability was giving way to a period of calm, due largely and unexpectedly to American businessmen and financiers. America had loaned billions of dollars to the Allies to fight the war, and billions more as they rebuilt. But when Germany faltered in the aftermath of Versailles, so did the rest of Europe, threatening American financial interests. So in 1924, we led negotiations that rescheduled Germany's war payments. The Dawes Plan, coupled with the German currency reform and other measures, allowed Germany to recover. As trade resumed, Britain and France followed.
With prosperity nurturing democracy in Germany, stability and peace prevailed in Europe. What the politicians had failed to do at Versailles, businessmen had done with the free flow of trade and money. Then a crack appeared in the surface. Progress always causes disruptions and painful periods of readjustment. But for the late 1920s, the American farmer was hard-pressed.
Traditionally, farmers had to set aside large tracts of land to grow forage for their draft animals. Now the tractor was rapidly replacing the mule. Millions of acres were being freed for food production. The American farmers were growing too much grain and livestock. Their markets were depressed. Their own overproduction was the problem, but a scapegoat was found. foreign competition. The cry against imports went out from the Farm Belt, and Washington responded. But if you protect the producers of wheat and cheese, why not cement and chemicals, steel and paper? Tariffs became the issue of the day. 14 separate congressional subcommittees held hearings as each industry lobbied to get its share of protection. While Washington debated, Wall Street reacted. In October 1929, the stock market crashed. Most observers thought the crash was simply a financial panic. Indeed, there had been rampant speculation. Now, with the excesses squeezed out of the system, they assumed things would recover quickly, just as they had many times before. Editor of Forbes magazine, B.C. Forbes.
I am absolutely confident that stocks purchased during this panic, and we've had a panic, make no mistake about that, will also yield very generous profits. Now is the time to buy.
Noted economist Irving Fisher.
This country is fundamentally sound, and the technical situation in the stock market is not going to prevent the great improvement, progressive improvement in our wonderful prosperity.
In June 1930, President Herbert Hoover signed the tariff, confident it would help stem the crisis.
We are convinced that we have overcome the major financial crisis, a crisis in severity unparalleled in the history of the world, and that with its relaxation, confidence and hope have reappeared in the world.
But Hoover was wrong. His policies didn't solve the crisis. They'd caused it. And they would drive America and the world into the Great Depression. Just as the stock market had anticipated, other nations retaliated against the U.S. tariffs by raising their own. Trade collapsed and capital flows dried up, destroying jobs and industries as ruthlessly as machine guns and artillery had cut down soldiers in the war. Thousands of banks failed. Tens of thousands of factories went out of business. Hundreds of thousands of farmers were forced from their land and their livelihoods. Millions lost their jobs. Depression spread across the globe, democracy was widely repudiated as weak and corrupt. In the eyes of many, it could no longer produce prosperity, and country after country looked elsewhere for answers.
In Germany, during the 1928 elections, Hitler's Nazi Party polled a mere 2.5% of the vote. 5 years later, in 1933, it was the largest political force in Germany, and Hitler was dictator. He began a military buildup, and German unemployment vanished. In Japan, the militarists also took control, and the army invaded Manchuria. It was the first step in creating what the Japanese were to call the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The old idea that militarism and conquest were the road to prosperity was once again leading the world toward global war. Isolationism, 10 years of American protectionism. Now it was America's turn to face the consequences.
Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Japan's triumph at Pearl Harbor and quick success throughout Asia and the Pacific. Germany's easy conquests in Europe and Africa. They all seem to confirm the weakness of democracy and the strength of the dictators. We were unprepared for war. Production was the key to victory, and the Germans and the Japanese had been building their war machines for years. Skeptics on both sides agreed with Goering when he assured Hitler, the Americans cannot build airplanes, though they are very good at refrigerators and razor blades.
But the processes used to build refrigerators were essentially the same as the ones used to make airplanes. Between 1937 and 1941, Japan tripled the size of its air force to 4,500 planes. By 1943, American factories were producing 7,000 planes each month. When we entered the war, the Allies were in desperate need of shipping. Henry J. Kaiser, a California construction magnate who knew nothing of shipbuilding before the war, used mass production techniques to build the Liberty ship, a 10,000-ton cargo vessel.
This model is a replica of the Liberty ship, which we built in 4.5 days, and we expect to build many more of them in a shorter time.
Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of planes, millions of trucks. Converting to war production was not simple or easy, but Americans went at the task with an imagination and energy that surprised our friends and crushed the enemy. At the Big Three conference in Tehran, even Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin offered a toast to American production, without which this war would have been lost.
As the victorious Soviet and American armies met at the Elbe River in Germany in 1945, there were now only two dominant forces in the world: communism and democracy. Which would prevail was an open question.
Turns on the Discovery Channel.
Europe was shattered. Its economies virtually had ceased to function. There was little coal, steel, or food, and even less hope. The Soviets reneged on wartime agreements to hold free elections in Eastern Europe and were arming communist insurgents in Greece. America did not turn away. We now understood that when democracy was threatened in Europe, we were threatened. With Eastern Europe already lost to Soviet communism, America moved to save Western Europe.
But there's no doubt whatever in my mind that if we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully. And there's also no doubt in my mind that the whole world hangs in the balance as to what it is to be.
The Marshall Plan provided food, equipment, money, and material to revive the battered economies and rekindle hope for the people. And to assure economic revival, America negotiated other agreements promoting the free flow of trade and money. Prosperity was the key to nurturing democracy, and democracy was the foundation of peace. But prosperity and democracy could not blossom without security from conquest, not with the Soviets to the east. By 1948, the Cold War already was underway. The Soviets moved to test America's commitment to Europe by cutting off Berlin. It appeared that America and its allies, Britain and France, could either accept the fait accompli or risk war by moving supplies to the city through Soviet-occupied East Germany. Instead, we organized an airlift of unprecedented scale and flew more than 2 million tons of vital supplies into the city. The Soviets backed down, reopening the railroads and highways to the west. The Berlin airlift galvanized America and its allies into organizing a formal defense against Soviet aggression. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO.
The Atlantic Pact is a collective self-defense arrangement among the countries of the North Atlantic area. We have learned our history lesson from 2 world wars in less than half a century. That experience has taught us that the control of Europe by a single, aggressive, unfriendly power would constitute an intolerable threat to the national security of the United States.
With American assistance and leadership, Western Europe began a miraculous recovery, and West Germany became securely democratic. In Japan, too, the devastation of the war began giving way to economic recovery, and democracy was taking root.
At home, America began the greatest economic boom in history. others solved a housing shortage by putting up homes the way they had army barracks during the war.
I am Ted Doris, and this is my wife. I'm a veteran of World War II, and my wife and I, for a long time, have been wanting to buy a house. We will now be able to buy the home we've always wanted.
Soon, for the first time anywhere, more families owned their own homes than not. And once we had homes, we filled them up with babies and new appliances. Television replaced radio, movies, and newspapers as the prime medium of entertainment, news, and advertising.
Dessert time, tea time, don't miss with.
As the man around here, you can quote me on this. You, it's Swiss cream sandwich for you.
And you.
Nothing had so visibly permeated American life since the automobile. Americans had more money and more time to spend it. This, in turn, led to new industries and new services. Air conditioning made possible the growth of the Sun Belt. Superhighways began crisscrossing the country. Jet aircraft made the whole world accessible to businessmen and tourists. And credit cards assured instant acceptance wherever we traveled. But there was more to the post-war boom than credit cards and TV shows. It gave democracy new impetus as well. The GI Bill had given millions the opportunity to go to college. Through the 1950s and 1960s, higher education was being democratized, the way primary and secondary education had been before. And more education meant more opportunities for more people, including black Americans. Schools became the lightning rod for civil rights in America. Buses, lunch counters, and polling places followed as people took a stand against racial injustice. For a decade, Dr. Martin Luther King led nonviolent marches and demonstrations. When segregationists responded with brutality, TV cameras were there, bringing home to average white Americans the ugliness and unfairness of racism and segregation. Slowly, too slowly, America began to change.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
But even as America and democracy moved forward, the Soviets were advancing as well. In China, Mao's communists won a long and bitter civil war and established the People's Republic in 1949. In Korea, it took 3 years of bloody fighting, 2 years of frustrating negotiations, and finally the threat of nuclear weapons to prevent a takeover by the Communist North. In Southeast Asia, communist guerrillas led by Ho Chi Minh defeated the French, dividing Vietnam into North and South. Fidel Castro triumphed in Cuba. Communism and the Soviet Union were powerful and aggressive foes.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe,
to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Bold and stirring words. In a very real way, they reflected how America saw its role in the Cold War world of 1961. From the 38th parallel in Korea to Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, we were engaged in containing communism.
The bankruptcy of unstable governments, one by one,
But Kennedy's powerful rhetoric led too easily to policies that were at once overreaching and ill-defined. And that would cost America and democracy dearly in the years to come.
South Vietnam was seen as a key commitment in the struggle to contain communism. And in 1961, 7,000 troops were dispatched to train and advise the South Vietnamese Army. In 1963, with 17,000 Americans now in the country, the United States backed a bloody coup to bring in a new government that it hoped would be more effective in waging war against the communists. By 1965, South Vietnam was on the verge of collapse. The U.S. government responded by pouring in American troops and became the major force in the war. By 1968, more than 500,000 Americans were fighting and dying in Southeast Asia.
The heavy bombing raids that have been initiated on North Vietnam have done little to change the character of this strange war. South Vietnam remains pockmarked with centers of Viet Cong action like this. It's a war of search and shoot, seek and kill. To the Vietnamese and their American comrades, it remains mostly a war of frustration.
To Americans at home, the war had become a bottomless pit of lives, money, and spirit. Like World War I, Vietnam was a political and military failure. It was determined to be vital to our long-term safety, yet we never fought to win. It was a limited war, and yet we let the enemy define the terms of combat. And worst of all, our leaders failed to persuade us that the bloodletting had any higher purpose. As support for the war drained away, our confidence went with it. Many began to question our purpose and role in the world. After years of stalemate, we finally withdrew, leaving the South to fend for itself. Within 2 years, it was taken over by the communists. With our failure in Vietnam, isolationism re-emerged as a theme in American politics.
The war had also triggered inflation, and that began to undermine the economy at home and the value of the dollar around the world.
I am today ordering
a freeze on all prices and wages.
In response, President Richard Nixon imposed wage and price controls and shut the gold window in 1971. Not since Hoover's tariffs had we taken an action so disruptive to the free flow of trade and money. Then in late 1973, the Arabs cut off oil shipments to the West. With the embargo, gas prices soared, and shortages became commonplace. Many concluded that this was just the beginning of a permanent energy crisis. The post-war boom was over. And as the economy sputtered, the greatest political scandal in American history unfolded in Washington.
The president told me I'd done a good job, and he appreciated how difficult a task it had been, and the president was pleased that the case had stopped with Liddy.
I have never been a quitter.
For the first time, an American president was forced to resign from office.
Feeling betrayed and weary, suffering from the combined effects of Vietnam, chronic inflation, recession, and political scandal, America responded by turning away from the world responsibilities it alone was capable of bearing.
We are now free of that inordinate fear of communism. For too many years, we've been willing to adopt the flawed and erroneous principles and tactics of our adversaries, sometimes abandoning our own values for theirs.
This new isolationism was different from any that had come before. In the past, we'd felt the world was somehow unworthy of America, that involvement over there would lead to corruption here. Now, many felt that America itself was unworthy, and that we could only do more harm than good in the world. With America's turn inward, the forces of tyranny and intolerance, terror and genocide once again seized center stage in the affairs of the world.
With the fall of Saigon to the communists in 1975, an exodus of Vietnamese refugees began that continues still today. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge murdered more than 1 million to enforce its vision of a new society. Middle East leaders began using terrorism as an instrument of national policy. In Ethiopia, a Marxist regime came to power that would use famine and starvation to quell rebellion. Cuban troops propped up the government of Angola. The Sandinistas took over in Nicaragua. The Ayatollah Khomeini led an Islamic fundamentalist revolution in Iran and took American diplomats hostage. Finally, the Soviets, increasingly confident that they had a free hand, invaded Afghanistan.
Not since the 1930s were the forces of democracy under such fire, and not since then had America appeared so insecure economically. By 1979, President Jimmy Carter expressed the fear many Americans felt.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
But despite the dark times and the apparent loss of confidence, innovation and inventiveness had not slowed at all during the 1970s. While many worried that we were running out of resources, a handful of visionaries were demonstrating anew that the greatest resource is the imagination and creativity of individuals.
Microchips are the essential building blocks of computers and every other electronic device. They are extending the power of the human mind today the way machines did human muscle in the 19th century. of the microchip? Sand. The first general-purpose computers had been developed in the 1940s. They filled large rooms, were very costly, and required highly trained technicians to run them. In 1971, the microchip was developed, enabling first thousands, then tens of thousands, and now hundreds of thousands of transistors to fit in the space of a fingernail. By the 1980s, a personal computer fit easily on a desk, cost 1/100th of the price, was simple to operate, and was far more powerful. Developing and producing microchips required large capital outlays and sophisticated factories. But the uses they could be put to were often within the reach of basement and garage tinkerers. A revolution from below began revitalizing the American economy. The personal computer itself was invented in 1975 by two college dropouts, Stephen Jobs and Stephen Wozniak, working in a garage.
It's not going to happen at once, and it's certainly not an 1984-ish vision at all. It's just going to be very gradual and very human, and will seduce you into learning how to use it.
Today, millions of personal computers manufactured by dozens of companies that didn't exist before 1975 are sold each year. They have become indispensable tools to scientists and secretaries, students and artists alike. With a base of personal computers installed, software firms sprang up to provide them with programs for new uses. Many of these firms started with hardly any capital at all.
Dedicated to those of you who've supported Windows since its introduction back in 1983.
William Gates, another college dropout, began Microsoft with little more than an idea. He created the operating software for IBM's personal computers, and it became the standard of the industry. As the microchip gave rise to new industries and new services, it changed others. Barcodes and laser wands made checking out at the store faster, while letting retailers control their inventories better. And that made them more responsive to consumer taste as well as more profitable. In fact, almost nothing in our daily lives has been untouched by the microchip. The microchip was giving people new access and power, much the way the automobile had given us new mobility and affluence 2 generations before. Progress was not simply the fruit of democracy, it also fostered it.
As innovation was reaffirming our traditional faith in the individual, so too were our political leaders. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president. He swept into office calling for dramatic economic reforms, renewed patriotism, and reclaiming our leadership role in the world.
I believe that the American people were basically hungry for a recovery of the patriotism and spirit that America once had. I like to describe what I actually did was I got the government out of the way and the people did the rest.
In 4 years, new and smaller businesses in America added more than 18 million people to their payrolls. Real incomes began rising again after declining in the 1970s. It was the most dramatic and sustained boom since the 1950s. America was restoring and rejuvenating itself. As it did, we regained confidence in our place and purpose in the world. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher saw it this way.
There was a kind of theory, philosophy, that if you couldn't beat communism, you just try to contain it. It was a containment of communism. We were defensive organizations to defend liberty. But you could try to contain communism, because the doctrine of communism then was that this thing they'd got would spread the world over, and they would try to do that either by military might or by military threat or by subversion. And we said, right, the first thing is to contain it. Now, President Reagan and I said, right, that's not good enough. There are whole peoples there being kept under by the new tyranny of communism. They can't choose who governs them. The Constitution is communism, it denies them choice. We must show them not only that our way of life works, but it is infinitely morally superior to others, and we go out and we fight the battle of ideas.
For decades, the Soviet Union had been able to keep pace with the West militarily. Now, the pace of technological change in America and the West threatened the effectiveness of that military power. In Afghanistan, we armed the ragtag guerrilla forces with Stinger missiles. These shoulder-fired, microchip-guided anti-aircraft weapons effectively grounded the Soviet air forces. Without air mobility and air support, the Soviets were stalemated on the ground. Eventually, they withdrew. It was a failure at least as damaging as America's in Vietnam. At the same time, the Soviets were losing the battle of ideas.
Tyrannies always have sought to control access to information and restrict communications between people. When television first appeared, many feared it would become a powerful instrument of control, as Big Brother used it for propaganda. But in the 1980s, the opposite happened. In communist countries, the impact of Western communications was explosive. Polish President Lech Walesa explains.
When the first cassette players appeared on this market, and we used these tapes to transfer different messages, they would confiscate the tapes. Again, if you bought a VCR, you had to register it. And till today, I think, you still have to register your satellite dish. And I thought this was funny. And I told them, okay. As long as these satellite dishes are so big, you'll find them. And if I have something matchbox size, then you won't manage. So that system obstructed development, so to speak. So it couldn't survive.
By 1985, the failures of the communist system could no longer be denied. While there was ample grain in the fields, there was little bread, cheese, and meat in the shops. Consumer goods were shoddy and scarce. Year after year, people had gone without. A joke captured the frustration. They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power facing a grim reality. The Soviet Union had been drained by a massive military complex that could no longer compete.
Well, Gorbachev had discovered, after he was appointed to the head man position, that he had inherited an economic basket case. And faced with that, he then discovered and decided that that economic disaster had been brought about by the Russians spending on the military. So here was a man that knew that just engaging in military contests was no longer the answer to save economically his country.
The Soviet Union was still the largest producer of steel, oil, and cement. longer the source of power and wealth. Information and knowledge had become the raw materials of growth. Technological know-how and entrepreneurial creativity increasingly drove progress.
The wealth of nations springs from the enterprise of its people and a government which enables that enterprise to develop. Just look, you can test it quickly. It does not come from the natural resources of a nation. If it did, Russia would now be the richest nation in the world.
Gorbachev began a series of limited economic and political reforms to stimulate the country, but communism was unable to adapt. Reform proved uncontrollable. In 1989, Gorbachev made it clear that the Soviet army would no longer intervene in the domestic affairs of Eastern European countries. Almost immediately, they swept away their communist regimes and began the struggle to install democracies and market economies. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist.
We had a lot of everything: land, oil, and gas, other natural resources. And there was intellect and talent in abundance. However, we were living much worse than people in the industrialized countries, and we were increasingly lagging behind them. The reason was obvious even then. The country was suffocating in the shackles of the bureaucratic command system, doomed to cater to ideology and suffer and carry the onerous burden of the arms race. It found itself at the breaking point. All the half-hearted reforms, and there have been a lot of them, fell through one after another. This country was going nowhere, and we couldn't possibly live the way we did. We had to change everything radically.
The Red Star was lowered, and the flag of Russia flew over the Kremlin for the first time in 75 years, a symbol of hope for democracy and freedom around the world.
The crossroads of history again. We've learned the hard way that democracy cannot survive without leadership. Only America has a living history of democracy and the political and economic strength to lead. Isolationism and protectionism are the fear of leadership, whether they stem from thinking we're better than the world, as we did in the 1920s, or that we're dangerous to the world, as many felt in the 1970s, or that we can't compete in the world, as some feel today. The consequence is the same. But if we don't shrink from our responsibilities, we can redeem the promise that began this century. Not only for ourselves, but for the world. Not only for our generation, but for generations to come.